Well, we were fortunate enough that all the speakers stuck to the limit of, so we have time now for questions and answers. Yes, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for an excellent opening session. And I have a question for Ruth Gavison. Your thesis is that we must secure political freedom subject to constraints. Now, my question is, how are the constraints be determined?
In democracy, one of the main ideas is that we translate the question, what is right, to the question, how do we decide? Because we assume that we live in a society that is conflicted, there are many interests, many groups. We cannot reach unanimity, and we cannot and do not want always to vote, majority vote on every issue. So what we need is a system of rules that maintains the balance of power between different loci and foci of power that work differently. Now, the details of how these powers are elected and the relations between them is something that each demos has to decide for itself. There is no one right answer to this institutional question. But a democracy is more successful when its institutional, complex, procedural setup is such that the balance between the ideas and the powers is best. Now, this is one issue about democracy and rights. Democracy is decided by elections, primarily, and their human rights usually, because they are pre-state and above states and non-partisan, are decided or should be decided by non-elected institutions. This is right. This is a good argument for the power of non-elected institutions to not violate, break human rights. However, if every political position is presented as a human rights issue, then the institutional implication that this is for rights for courts to decide or other non-elected, then it gets weaker and weaker and raises more and more anger, alienation, and frustration. So part of the issue is that the procedural rules of democracy, because they want wisely to abstain from having a substantive answer to all political debates, which is basically anti-democratic, they need to structure the powers between the checks and balances in a way that will maintain rights and democracy to be narrow limitations, so that most of the decisions are indeed made by the elected government, reflecting the sentiments of the community. Israel is, many people, the liberal democracy, some of them say that democracy and human rights are the same thing, and they are against particularism, Judaism. I think this is a terrible mistake, because as I suggested, democracy and human rights are both parts of the shared commitment, but they're different, because human rights is universal, global, and democracy is demos-oriented. So Judaism, which is demos-oriented, is also the source of some of the depth of a human rights commitment. It's not democracy and human rights versus Judaism. Human rights would be strong in a political community if human rights are also part of Judaism and Islam and whatever communities we have here. So we don't want to frame the debate in this way. We want communities to feel as committed to the shared part of the political community, both democracy and human rights in their complex ways, through their own culture, rather than only as external constraints imposed by others. Excuse the length.
Yes, please.
Thank you. When you say that gatekeepers can't do the job, I'm talking to Ruth Gavison. When you say that gatekeepers shouldn't be asked to do the job, I think that it's true that when gatekeepers do the job, it rouses great anger amongst part of the population, because part of the population is not in favour of human rights constraints on government. And it's not just Judaism, it's also Islam, it's also Christianity, it's also Hindu, it's also, in recent days, Buddhism, which one would not have expected. And so it goes together with what the previous speakers have said. You know, there are two forces which we're not sure which is going to prevail. One of them is anti-democratic and anti-human rights, and it may form a majority. And the move towards having gatekeepers has indeed been universal. There are human rights courts. There's the International Court of Criminal Justice. There is, in the European Union, the European Court of Human Rights. And this has been an attempt to make sure that universal constraints are imposed on demoses which are not prepared to respect human rights. So I want to know what you do. I agree that it's not pleasant to have to deal with, and it's a question to all the speakers, what do you do when you have a large part of the population which is of the demos, as you put it, which is not interested, which is opposed to human rights? Thank you.
What I claim is that the tension is imminent. It's not something that should be seen as something that is contingent. And the tension, as I think you agree, actually, is imminent. And I think, like many other people, that freedom, equality, and human rights are ultimately best protected when they are in the minds of hearts of the community. And my wishful thinking is a belief that in most human communities, if you are doing it in the right way, you can make people see and appreciate that, yes, human rights in some sense should be respected by all. The ethos of human rights, by the way, is like that, because the claims of universality of human rights, if they are taken seriously, tend to build on the fact that human rights should be internalized. We don't say that human rights should be enforced because they can be enforced. Human rights are not only for democracies. Democratic rulers have a duty, moral duty and a political duty, to implement and legalize the human rights that suit their demos. But the obligation to obey human rights is not stemming from democracy. This is why there is an imminent tension. But ultimately, you may have societies that indeed will vote for populist democracy or for totalitarian democracy, and this is a serious problem. But then I go back to my predecessors. The question is the only way a liberal Democrat should respond to this challenge by saying, we are right, we should be strong, our gatekeepers should do their work? Or do we have to also take stock of the idea that maybe something that the democratic elites in the West have been doing is not sufficiently responsive, not to people who want unlimited power, not to populists who just hate strangers, but also to the demands and expectations of people that their ruler will take care of their real concerns of work, dignity, a kind of existence within a community that will take care of their interests and will not necessarily always give precedence to the interests of the elites themselves or to the interests of the global community. Now, I think that we should invite both. I think we should have very strong gatekeepers, but we should also think that there may be a real political issue here, and the key, as far as I can see, is solidarity. Democracy requires a real sense of solidarity among the demos. If you don't do enough to do that by taking care, first and foremost, in a respectable way, to the need of your communities, you risk gaining the approval of maybe human rights NGOs, but you risk losing the support of those people without whom you cannot have democratic legitimacy. And if we want to maintain democracy and free elections and free ability to change government, the idea that you need to persuade the majority of the people to vote you into power is a critical idea of democratic policies, and I think we shouldn't give up on the people that we are supposed to serve.
Yes.
Let me follow up what Ruti has said about the demos, because the focus on the centrality of the demos and the solidarity with the demos is crucial. But this raises a question, and I want to move from principle to praxis. When you have a political leadership, be it in the United States or in Israel, which is delegitimizing part of the demos, calling part of the demos leftists, traitors, terrorists, then you are undermining the basis of democracy. And I think we have to be very, very clear about that. Democracy is a contest for power where you accept the legitimacy of opposing you when you are in power. When you have people in power who define anybody who opposes them as traitors, strangers, not part of the people, whose right to vote is problematic, and if they try to vote, this is basically it's illegitimate. You are undermining democracy. And it seems to me we have to be very, very clear about that. A political debate about political views, about whatever, foreign policy, economic policy, the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians are legitimate disagreements, and they are part of the fact that the demos has a legitimate need for exchange of opinion. Otherwise, we are moving into something like totalitarianism. When you begin, and we have seen it both in the United States and in Israel, and one can give other examples as well, but I want to focus on these because they are very, very extreme, in which the leadership, which is in power, has been democratically elected and has to be respected as being democratically elected. But then it challenges the legitimacy of the opposition. As part of the demos, we have a very, very serious problem. It has nothing to do with principles. It has to do with political practice, and it has to be said very much openly to the people in power. Once you delegitimize the opposition, you delegitimize your own position, and in a very, very fundamental way, you delegitimize democracy.
Dominique, please.
Well, the point I would like to make is that for a new generation, the very young, who have always lived within a world where democracy and freedom existed, democracy may not be a priority. They take to the streets for the survival of the planet all over the Western world. They wouldn't go to the streets for the survival of a democratic regime of any nature. And how do you teach what freedom is to a generation of people that have always known freedom? How do you explain what it meant before 1989 to cross Berlin through Checkpoint Charlie, to arrive in Bucharest in 1981, and to sense immediately that the air was simply missing? It's very, very difficult to transmit that experience. How do you say to people, well, I can't tell you what freedom is, but I can explain to you what the absence of freedom means? This is, I think, the most important pedagogic mission, and we fail so far to transmit that. And then there is another part, which is freedom and democracy are luxuries you cannot afford. I was very struck by a program on the BBC. They were coming back to Syria, and there was a father holding the body of his deceased child, and he was saying, well, I was really against Bashar al-Assad, but now I want order for my other children to survive, and I don't care from which side that order will come. So you have benign neglect and ignorance on the one end, and total despair on the other end, that lead to a certain relativization of democracy and freedom. And this being said, I totally agree with Ruth. The concept of solidarity is absolutely crucial.
Well, I was reminded that there is a general discussion at the end of the day, and also there is a demand from the demos to have some coffee. So thank you all.